Picture the sky over southern Kuwait in the last week of February, 1991. The sun barely gets through. The retreating Iraqi army has set the oil fields alight, and the smoke has turned midday into a kind of dirty dusk. Somewhere under that ceiling, low and slow, comes a sound no soldier who heard it ever forgot. Not a scream, not a roar, a tearing growl like the sky itself being ripped in half. 2 seconds of it, and an Iraqi tank sitting in a revetment beside the highway west out of Kuwait City simply comes apart. The thing that made that sound is not beautiful. It is blunt and gray and slow, built around a cannon roughly the size of a small car, and it flies close enough to the ground that the men it hunts can sometimes make out the pilot's helmet. Its crews chose its name with affection and contempt in equal measure. They call it the Warthog. Here is the part that should stop you. The aircraft carving up Saddam Hussein's armored divisions that week was an aircraft the United States Air Force had spent the better part of a decade trying to get rid of. Not the enemy's Air Force, its own. The generals who ran American air power looked at this ugly, low, subsonic gun platform and saw an embarrassment. A relic built for a Soviet tank charge across Germany that never came, doing a mission they had never wanted in the first place. They tried to cancel it before it flew. They tried to retire it after. And in the winter of 1991, that unwanted machine went out over the desert and became the deadliest tank killer of the entire war. So the question this video answers is a simple one, and the answer is more tangled than either its worshippers or its critics will admit. How did the plane nobody in the building wanted become the one the men on the ground prayed for? What did it actually do out there? Not what the recruiting posters claim, but what the loss records and the satellite photographs and the pilot's own gun cameras show. And why, 35 years later, is the Air Force still trying to kill it and still failing? Keep that growl in your head. We are going to come back to it. To understand why the Warthog's Gulf War matters, you first have to understand how little its own service thought of it going in. The A-10 was born out of a bad memory. In Vietnam, the Air Force had watched its fast jets struggle to protect the soldiers on the ground. They would scream over a target at hundreds of miles an hour, get one look, then come around again while the men below waited to be hit. Aircraft designed to kill other aircraft or to flatten cities were simply not good at the patient, dangerous work of killing the tank that was about to overrun a friendly position. So, in the late 1960s, the Air Force set out to build something it had never built before. An aircraft designed from a blank sheet for one job only: close air support, flying low and slow over the battlefield to keep the troops alive. The man who shaped its requirements, a Pentagon analyst named Pierre Sprey, studied the propeller-driven attack planes of earlier wars and came back with a heretical answer. What the ground troops needed was not speed. It was the opposite of speed. Long loiter time, so the plane could stay over the fight. Low speed handling, so it could turn tight and low. A devastating gun. And above all else, the ability to take a hit and keep flying. He was, in effect, designing a slow plane inside an Air Force that worshipped fast ones. And that was the problem the A-10 carried from the day it entered service in 1977. The culture of the Air Force ran on speed, altitude, and technology. On air superiority and precision bombing. On the fighter pilot's silk scarf mystique. Close air support was the ugly chore nobody wanted, and the A-10 was its ugly avatar. Most pilots did not want to fly it. By the late 1980s, with the Cold War winding down and the great Soviet tank charge across the German plain looking less and less likely, senior leadership was already talking openly about scrapping it. The argument was that a modern multi-role fighter like the F-16 could do the close support job just as well and faster. That was the settled wisdom in the summer of 1990, as the argument was quietly ending in the A-10's disfavor. And then, on the 2nd of August, Iraq invaded Kuwait. And the unwanted plane got the one thing it had never had: a war of exactly the kind it was built for. Before we get to what it did, you need to understand the machine, because almost everything strange about the A-10's combat record comes straight out of its design. Start with the gun, because the airplane did. Most aircraft are designed first and then fitted with a weapon. The A-10 was built the other way around. Its designers started with a cannon, the GAU-8 Avenger, and then wrapped an airplane snugly around it. And what a cannon! 7 barrels, 30 millimeters across, spinning like a Gatling gun, and throwing shells at nearly 65 rounds a second. A burst that does not come out as individual shots, but as that single tearing growl. The complete gun system, loaded, weighs about 4,000 pounds. That is not a figure of speech about firepower. The gun and its ammunition drum weigh roughly as much as a small car and make up around a sixth of the entire aircraft's weight. Pull the gun out, and the plane tips back onto its tail. The shells it fires are not ordinary either. The armor-piercing rounds carry a penetrator made of depleted uranium, a metal so dense it punches through the steel armor of a tank at 1,000 yards and well beyond. Pilots learn to aim for the thinner armor on a tank's top and rear, where those rounds went through as if the plating were not there. Now, here is the detail that turns up in every bar argument about this airplane, and it happens to be true. The recoil of that gun, the backward shove it delivers each time it fires, is around 10,000 pounds of force. Each of the A-10's two engines produces a little over 9,000 pounds of thrust. Do the arithmetic on that. The gun's kick is stronger than the push of one whole engine, which is the seed of the great myth, the one you have probably heard, that when a Warthog fires its cannon, the recoil stalls it, and it falls out of the sky. That part is not true. The plane does not fall. It simply slows, bleeding off a little speed until thrust and drag balance the recoil back out. But you can measure the deceleration. There is genuinely an aircraft in the world whose gun fights its own engines to a draw. The gun sits slightly off-center, nudged to the left, so that whichever barrel is actually firing at any instant lines up with the center line of the plane. Otherwise, that colossal recoil would twist the nose right off the target. The nose landing gear had to be shoved over to the right to make room for it. Then there is the armor. The pilot sits inside a bathtub, a tub of titanium plate, around 1,200 pounds of it, wrapped around the cockpit and the flight controls and rated to shrug off hits that would shred an ordinary aircraft. The two engines are mounted high and far apart on the rear fuselage, so that ground fire is less likely to take both, and so the hot exhaust is harder for a heat-seeking missile to find. There are redundant hydraulic systems, and if every one of them fails, the pilot can fall back on a manual mode and fly the airplane on raw cables and muscle. The fuel tanks are self-sealing and packed with foam to resist fire. It is, in the most literal sense the phrase will allow, a flying tank built to kill tanks. Now the war. The first surprise of the A-10's Gulf War is that it spent very little of it doing the job it was designed for. Close air support means friendly and enemy troops locked in close together, and for most of the 6-week air campaign, they simply were not. So instead the Warthogs were sent deeper, out over the Iraqi rear, hunting tanks and artillery and supply columns in what the Air Force calls battlefield air interdiction. It was a role the plane was never built for, over territory thick with anti-aircraft guns and shoulder-fired missiles. And the A-10 turned out to be far more versatile and far better at surviving out there than almost anyone had predicted. At first, they flew high, above 15,000 feet, safely out of reach of most of the guns. The trouble was that from up there, it was hard to tell a tank from a truck from a decoy. So at the end of January, the order came down. Get lower. Down to 4, 5, 7,000 feet. Low enough to pick the targets out by eye in the kill boxes of occupied Kuwait. The tank kills climbed. So did the battle damage, because lower meant closer to every gunner in Iraq. When the ground war finally opened in late February, the air commander, General Chuck Horner, told his A-10 crews to fly as low as they needed to. "You have a sacred duty," he said, "to help the men on the ground." The single most famous day belongs to two men. On the 25th of February, Captain Eric Solomonson and First Lieutenant John Marks flew 3 separate sorties and, between them, destroyed 23 Iraqi tanks in a single day. The middle sortie is the one to sit inside. Picture it. A low, rainy overcast pressed down under the black oil smoke. The light gone strange and dim in the early afternoon. Heavy anti-aircraft fire coming up from a column near Kuwait City. Marks later described it as dark and eerie, the sky choked with smoke and rain. A Marine forward air controller on the ground, waiting on that target, finally cut through the hesitation on the radio. Marks remembered it as something close to, "Look, are you coming in or not?" And as he put it, when you say that to 2 hog drivers, it is like a slap in the face. So they went in. 8 more tanks, in that murk, at that height, with the guns firing back the whole time. Marks alone accounted for 12 of the 23 that day. The Wings Operations Center told them afterward they had set a record for tank kills with the Maverick missile and the gun. Marks would go on to become the highest-time A-10 pilot in history, with more than 7,500 hours in the cockpit, before he finally retired in 2024. But the Warthog did more in that war than kill tanks. On the 21st of January, early in the campaign, a Navy F-14 crew was shot down deep inside Iraq. Captain Paul Johnson led a flight of A-10s on a search and rescue mission that ran nearly 6 hours. 3 mid-air refuelings, a strike on a suspected missile site, and hour after hour hunting for the downed pilot, deeper into enemy territory than any A-10 had ever gone, dropping down to 500 feet to find him. When an Iraqi truck came rolling toward the survivor, Johnson's flight destroyed it, and a special operations helicopter pulled the pilot out. For that mission, Johnson received the Air Force Cross, one of only 2 awarded in the entire war. 2 weeks later, a shoulder-fired missile blew a hole in the wing of his airplane and crippled one engine, and he flew it home anyway. If you are the kind of person who wants the real combat record, the loss numbers and the disputed claims and the honest verdict, not the recruiting poster version, subscribe to Combat Proven. That is the whole point of this channel. Now back to the war, because there is a stranger entry still in the A-10's logbook. It is an attack plane, a ground pounder, and in this war, it shot down enemy aircraft. On the 6th of February, Captain Robert Swain, flying with an Air Force Reserve unit, caught an Iraqi helicopter in the air and killed it with the gun, the first air-to-air kill in the A-10's history. He fired about 300 rounds, and by his own account, when he was finished there was nothing left to identify but pieces. His airplane earned the nickname Chopper Popper, and it sits on display at the Air Force Academy today. 9 days later, another A-10 pilot, Captain Todd Sheehy, downed an Iraqi Mi-8 helicopter with the gun as well, and destroyed a fighter parked on the ground the same day. You can measure the Warthog in tanks and sorties. The Iraqis measured it in fear. A captured Iraqi officer, debriefed near the end of February, told his interrogators that the single most recognizable and most feared aircraft at low level was the A-10. And it was not only the destruction, it was the loitering, the way the black jet would circle the target area before it struck, so that no one on the ground knew which of them it had chosen. The waiting was the weapon. By the numbers the Air Force kept, the results were staggering. The A-10 force flew more than 8,000 combat sorties, around a third of the entire Air Force's total, while firing the overwhelming majority of the war's Maverick missiles. It did this at a mission-capable rate of 95.7%, meaning almost every jet was ready to fly almost every time it was asked. That was actually higher than the A-10 had ever managed in peacetime. And the Air Force credited the Warthog force with destroying 987 tanks, 926 artillery pieces, and 1,355 other combat vehicles. Hold on to those 3 numbers. We are going to come back to them, because they are not quite what they seem, and the true story hiding underneath them is more interesting than the headline. Because the low flying that made the A-10 so deadly also made it a target. All through the campaign, the Warthogs were taking hits. 20 came home with serious battle damage, dozens more with lighter wounds patched between sorties, and some did not come home at all. On the 15th of February, Captain Stephen Phillis and his wingman, First Lieutenant Robert Sweet, attacked one of the Republican Guard's elite armored divisions. Sweet's airplane was hit by a missile. He ejected, and he was captured. Phillis stayed. He circled the crash site for 3 minutes and 45 seconds, a very long time to loiter over a place still full of the guns that had just killed one of his own, deliberately drawing their fire and calling in the rescue until he too was shot down and killed. He was given the Silver Star after his death, and there is a campaign, still going today, to raise it to the Medal of Honor. That same day, after the Republican Guard shot down 2 Warthogs and damaged a third, General Horner made a hard call. He pulled the A-10s off the Republican Guard entirely, and restricted them to within about 20 nautical miles of the border, because the attrition was becoming unsustainable. In all, 5 A-10s were lost to enemy fire in that war, with a 6th written off after a battle-damaged crash landing, and 2 of their pilots were killed. Every one of them fell to an infrared missile or to anti-aircraft fire, the heat seekers, and the guns. And here is the detail that matters, the one an honest channel has to name. Not one A-10 was brought down by a radar-guided missile, the most sophisticated threat in the Iraqi arsenal. But the lesson was already written in the sky on the 15th of February. Put this slow, low airplane in front of a serious, modern air defense, and it bleeds. Now, those 3 numbers: 987 tanks, 926 guns, 1,355 vehicles. Here is where an honest channel parts company with a cheerleading one. Those are not confirmed kills. They are the figures the Air Force credited to the A-10 force during and just after the war, and the entire business of counting what air power destroyed in the Gulf turned out to be badly, systematically inflated. This is not a knock aimed at the Warthog. It was a war-wide problem, and it is one of the best documented controversies in all of modern military history. Here is the disagreement, laid out plainly. Before the ground war began, American Central Command, leaning on the reports of the pilots themselves, estimated that air power had destroyed something like 40% of Iraq's tanks in the theater. But CIA analysts looking at that same battlefield through satellite imagery came back with a far lower number. After the war, the Government Accountability Office reported that, by the CIA's analysis, more than 70% of the tanks in 3 Republican Guard divisions were still intact when the ground campaign began, large numbers of them having simply driven away across the Euphrates. The Air Force's own independent study, the Gulf War Air Power Survey, concluded bluntly that the Iraqi army never ran out of tanks, armored carriers, or artillery. And the scholar Stephen Biddle, working through the same data, estimated that roughly 2,000 Iraqi tanks survived the air campaign altogether. There is a deeper problem hiding inside those counts, and it is the reason gun camera film can lie to you. A hit on film is not a kill, and a burning vehicle is not necessarily one that had a crew in it. Analysts found that a large share of the Iraqi armor destroyed on some fronts was empty when it was hit, abandoned by crews who had already deserted. You cannot always tell from 4,000 feet whether you are killing a tank or cremating one whose crew fled days ago. The very same illusion would repeat itself in Kosovo 8 years later, when NATO believed it had destroyed more than 100 Serbian tanks, and a ground survey afterward found only a small fraction of that. The rest were decoys and shadows. So does that gut the A-10's record? No. And here is where fairness cuts in the Warthog's favor. Its pilots flew low and slow and stayed over their targets, which means they saw what they hit in a way a fast jet screaming past at altitude never could. One of the pilots from that famous 23-tank day put it plainly. They only reported the things they actually watched blow up or catch fire. If any claims from that war deserve the benefit of the doubt, it is the ones made by the airplane that loitered close enough to watch the smoke rise. So the honest way to say it is this. The A-10 was, by a wide margin, the most prolific and the most cost-effective tank killer of the Gulf War. The precise body count is smaller than 987, and no one will ever know the true figure. But the Warthog's claims are, if anything, more trustworthy than most. If you flew one or crewed one, or you have seen footage or debriefs that I have not, put it in the comments. The real record on these systems is still being argued over, and the people who were actually there know things the archives never captured. So where does the Warthog actually rank? Strip away the inflated tallies, and the affection, and the memes, and here is the earned verdict. In the Gulf War, the A-10 was the best tank killer in the sky, and it was not especially close. 3 things made it so. The first was the gun, and what hung under the wings. A cannon firing dense uranium darts paired with a rack of cheap, reliable Maverick missiles, each one costing a small fraction of the $1 million-plus tank it killed. That combination let a single jet kill target after target on one pass through a column. The second was time. The A-10 could loiter, hang over the battlefield far longer than a fast jet could, find the targets, work them methodically, and stay to confirm the kill. And the third, the one everyone forgets, was honesty. Because it flew where it could see, its claims were grounded in observation, not optimism. Set against all of that is the shortcoming the Air Force was right about. Even if it was right for the wrong reasons. The A-10 is slow, low, and straight-winged, and against a serious modern air defense, it is vulnerable. The 15th of February, when 2 of them went down in a single day, and the whole force got yanked back off the Republican Guard, was a preview of what a real missile threat does to this airplane. So the Gulf War verdict is a split decision that somehow lands as a triumph. The plane nobody wanted turned out to be exactly the plane that war needed. The unwanted became the indispensable. That is the whole paradox of the Warthog in a single line, which brings us to the strangest part of the entire story, the part that is still happening. You would think an airplane that performed like that would have earned its place for good. It did not. The Air Force went right back to trying to retire it. It proposed scrapping the entire fleet in the budgets for 2015, 2016, and 2017. Congress blocked it every time. It tried partial retirements after that, and Congress blocked those too, writing hard legal floors into law to stop the service from cutting the fleet below a set number. Meanwhile, the plane just kept going to war. Bosnia, Kosovo, the no-fly zones over Iraq, the invasion in 2003, Afghanistan, Libya. the war against the Islamic State. The pattern became almost a joke inside the Pentagon. The Air Force proposes retirement. A war breaks out that needs exactly what the A-10 does, and Congress saves it one more time. And then it happened again. In the spring of 2026, during the war with Iran, the Warthogs went back into combat, flying close air support, hunting fast attack boats in the Strait of Hormuz with the gun, and flying rescue deep behind enemy lines for a downed F-15 crew. One A-10 was hit by Iranian fire, and its pilot ejected safely. And on the 20th of April, 2026, the Secretary of the Air Force announced that the airplane's retirement would be pushed back yet again, with 3 squadrons kept flying into 2030. The Defense Secretary's response was 2 words: "Long live the Warthog." But be clear-eyed about what that reprieve actually is, because this channel does not sell fairy tales. It is a slow sunset, not immortality. The plan takes the fleet down to something like 36 aircraft by 2030. The last class of A-10 student pilots has already graduated. The schoolhouses and depots that keep the fleet alive are already winding down, and the debate underneath all of it is real, and it is unresolved. The Air Force insists the A-10 cannot survive against the integrated air defenses of a peer enemy like China or Russia, and after the 15th of February 1991, that is not a crazy thing to believe. Its defenders answer that nothing else can put that gun, that loiter time, and that willingness to fly low over a soldier's head anywhere near the fight. Both of those things are true at the same time. That is exactly why the argument never dies. Go back one last time to that growl over the burning oil fields, the sound the Iraqi conscripts learned to fear before they ever saw the plane that made it. For 35 years, the United States Air Force has been trying to silence that sound. And for 35 years, the men on the ground and the enemies looking up have kept making the same argument the record made in 1991, that there has simply never been anything else quite like it. The ugly jet its own service kept trying to kill has outlived nearly everyone who tried. The Warthog was never beautiful. It was just right. So here's the question worth arguing over in the comments. When the last one finally lands for good, will the Air Force have been proved right that its day was over? Or will the next war do what every war before it has done and prove it wrong one more time? Tell me where you land, and subscribe to Combat Proven. The next system is already in the queue.